Just quickly before the episode starts, I know it's been a really long time since the first one already. I'm sorry for that, I didn't want that to happen, but this took way longer than what I was expecting. But yeah, before it starts, I just wanted to thank you all for the support on this series. I didn't see it coming at all. I was originally going to make this like a really rare type of video, like, you know, maybe once every month or every 2 months. It definitely wasn't going to be something that I would pursue on a consistent basis. But after seeing how much you guys enjoyed the first episode, all the positive comments and everything, you guys really wanted the next installment straight away. So yeah, my other type of content definitely isn't going away or anything like that. So if this isn't really your thing, don't worry, none of that is going away. But yeah, I was just gonna try this out on a pretty rare basis, and you guys really enjoy it, so I guess I'll do it more consistently. I just wanted to thank you guys also for giving me the opportunity to try out a range of different stuff. You guys have pretty much been watching whatever I've been trying, and I've really been experimenting with, you know, whatever I can, so yeah, just really wanted to thank you guys for that as well. But anyway, yeah, as you can see, there's a 2-week gap between episodes, which I really didn't want to happen, but this took me a ridiculously long time to finish. I've aged 11.5 years in the last week, but I finally have the episode here. Now, I know you probably just wanted to hurry up and play, but there was a good point in the comments that I have to address before we start. It's a new rule of sorts. I didn't want to be adding new rules as we go along, but I didn't even think of this until I saw the comments. So, what are we going to do about animals? There's a couple of times during the game where we're going to be forced into encountering some furry friends who aren't particularly friendly. They might want to tear our arms off our bodies or do the Listerine swish with our small intestines, but in terms of the no guns, no kills, golden guidelines, how are animals going to fit into this exactly? And not just with hostile animals, but with animals we're forced into hunting as well. Honestly, I don't think we'll have to worry about animals too much throughout the game, as far as I can remember, but for the sake of the few occasions that we do, here is a third golden guideline dedicated specifically to animals. Animals that are required to be killed when hunting is an unavoidable task can only be killed in the most honourable fashion possible. For example, a deer cannot be killed using 3 sticks of dynamite and a Molotov cocktail. That is wrong. When hunting, we must go into it using the same mindset as our good friend Charles. Animals when hunting are to be respected, 1 clean arrow to bring the deer down, 1 clean arrow to catch the squirrel, you get the idea. However, for hostile animals in missions where we cannot avoid killing them, if I cannot find any possible way of getting through otherwise, I can attack them, but not with a gun. Guns are a major no-no regardless of what Arthur is pointing it at in this playthrough, so I will try to avoid attacking the hostile animals at all, but if I can't, I can only resort to my fists. Thank you all again so much for the support on this series already, and yeah, enjoy episode 2. It's a bloody long one. The tale of Western Jesus and his equine companion Frank continues on as the vicious and unrelenting snowstorm they're surrounded by refuses to go to rest. As Dutch, Micah, Sadie, Arthur and Frank return to the gang, sleeping arrangements are made immediately as Dutch relays the plan to rob a train transporting a healthy supply of V-Bucks to Hosea. Hosea immediately disapproves as the gang already has enough on their plate, but the main priority right now is that everyone gets some rest. And so everybody goes off to their rooms to get some much needed sleep after last episode's ordeal. The following morning, Abigail requests that Arthur goes looking for John as he's been missing for a couple of days, and Javier actually agrees to go searching too. So the boys make a long trip up through the mountains. Frank spots a dead horse who he said he recognized as his great aunt's best friend's son's cousin, and after quickly paying his respects, the mission to find John continues. As the mountain's paths begin to narrow, we're forced to leave Frank behind and make the rest of the search on foot. Javier suggests I bring a shotgun with me, but we all know by now that Arthur will most definitely not be using that. After eating some beans and calling out John's name for a little bit, we finally discover John sitting on the edge of the mountain with a couple of brutal looking lacerations on his face.
You wanna know how I got these scars?
These lacerations are among some more serious injuries as well, so we begin carrying John back to the horses, but it's here that we encounter the first animal-related obstacle of the game. To put it as simply as I can, the wolves on that hill want our insides outside. and we of course want our insides in. But with John too injured to walk above the speed of a snail hooked on Xanax, and my refusal to let Arthur gun the wolves down, we're faced with a little bit of a problem. Since the wolves seem to be a little more focused on me than Javier and John, I decided my first solution to this problem would be to sprint for the horses, hop on Frank, and avoid the wolves until the boys could make their escape. However, following the theme of last episode, the horses could not be mounted. So I got the wolves' attention, attempted to stall them until the game allowed us to make our escape, but had my throat ripped out soon after. Now, even at this point, I was pretty confident I already knew the solution to this mission, so I decided I'd keep trying to outrun the wolves, giving John and Javier just enough time to get to the horses safely. I decided I'd shepherd these rocks, as running out in the open depleted Arthur's stamina much too quickly, and I got pretty close to making it back to the horses for the second attempt, but got torn to pieces just as the boys made it. A couple of failures in, but something told me that this was the strategy. It just seemed way too simple to not be the solution. So I continued with the same strategy, having complete faith at this moment that it would work. Now you're probably thinking, technically, according to the golden guideline number 3, I could just boot these wolves into next week and move on without having to attempt this so many times. It wouldn't add to the knockout or kill tally, it'd make this a lot quicker and a hell of a lot easier, but no. I was determined to get through here without splitting an innocent family of wolves apart, okay? I mean, look at their faces. Have you seen how cute they are? So in an effort to not become a wolf family homewrecker, I continued with this strategy, failing again and again, and even becoming a little disheartened when I discovered that despite getting back to Frank by the time Javier and John had reached the horses safely, the game still wouldn't allow us to mount our horse, meaning that we were being forced into killing the wolves to progress. After a couple more attempts that just ended in, well, I was actually given some slack. Arthur's good karma from last episode was already being rewarded with random acts of God. I took my usual route, past the wolves and onto the rocks, got bitten mid-air, made a break for Frank once again despite knowing I wouldn't be able to escape. But this time, as I ran past the cliff face Frank was standing beside, 2 of the wolves just disappeared. I turned around to see just 1 wolf now instead of 3, and in my confusion, I gave him a tap on the head and he ran away. After reviewing the footage and taking a look at the map, it seems as though the wolves simply fell off the cliff face when following me. Either that or Frank has some telekinetic abilities he isn't telling me about and straight up 11'd them into the abyss, but regardless of what happened. Because of this, I was able to scare the lone wolf away with my boot, as he no longer had his pack there to back him up. I suppose the wolf family still was technically wrecked, but Arthur's conscience was clear as he obviously had nothing to do with that. With the pack finally out of our way, we could continue getting John back to the camp. That is, until another pack decides to have a try at turning our vital organs into minced meat. Now to cut this segment short as nothing really happened, I had a couple of tries at just outrunning the wolves, which only ever resulted in someone being bitten, so being pretty confident that it was unavoidable, Frank trampled them until we reached a safe destination where the final wolf ran away. With John returned safely and in mostly one piece, there was another pressing issue that needed to be resolved. With Davey murdered and the perpetrator still unaccounted for, it comes as great news when Pearson informs us that the deer who killed him has been spotted in the woods not too far away. Charles agrees to come too, as he insists this deer is a merciless assassin with unbelievable abilities like none we've ever seen, so we gear up and trek back into the snow on a hunt for revenge in the name of Davey. We come across some tracks on the way and begin following them. I take my bow with me as this still needs to be done honourably, despite the atrocities this deer has committed, and before long, we find him. Now he seemed like a completely normal deer to me. He didn't appear to have any special abilities that Charles had spoken of, but when I pulled the bow back and shot with the precision of a highly experienced archer, he knew it was coming and dodged the arrow. Now his accomplice most definitely did not possess the same abilities, as he was brought down with one clean shot, but in a surprising turn of events that had absolutely nothing to do with an improvement of my aim, Davey's arrow-dodging killer was brought down just as easily too. Still felt weird to even be using a bow in this playthrough, but I figured that when it comes to hunting, which rarely is an unavoidable activity, one clean arrow was probably more honourable than beating a deer to a pulp. We bring Davey's killer back to Pearson, who informs us the body will be cremated, as feasting on the enemy would bring about bad luck. But Arthur and Charles knew full well he just wanted the whole deer for himself. Later that day, Dutch announces that it's time to ambush his arch-nemesis, Colm O'Driscoll, as the O'Driscolls we encountered last episode spoke of the V-Bucks robbery, along with having the equipment ready to carry it out. So most of the gang's able men began riding out to where we were informed the O'Driscolls were hiding. But what I didn't know is that I was also riding into where I would spend the next couple of days, completely and utterly stuck. I made a community post not too long ago that stated that episode 2 had crushed my soul while making it, and this mission right here is exactly what did it. The mission begins with us spying on Colm through some binoculars and formulating a plan of attack with Dutch. It's decided that Lenny and Javier should guard the top of the mountain while Arthur, Dutch, Micah and Bill make their way down to the bottom and attack from there. Now my plan going into this was very similar to what my plan was when going into episode 1. Restrain all of the enemies with a lasso and allow the allies we have with us to do any of the killing. The only thing that made this plan seem a little more feasible this time around was that now we actually had the lasso. Now of course for the first couple of attempts, I decided that I'd give an absolutely no contact run a try. We get the option to either take the lead ourselves or allow Dutch to make the first move. And obviously since I won't be unloading any of the bullets into the unsuspecting O'Driscolls myself, I let Dutch engage them first to initiate the shootout. I sat back while the Dutch Vanderlyn began the shootout by hitting the pole in front of him. Definitely an interesting strategy, but who was I to question his expertise? I continued to sit back while Dutch, Bill and Micah gradually pushed forward to engage the enemies, but I wasn't surprised to find out that sitting in the same spot and doing absolutely nothing resulted in one of the boys dying. This seemed to be a pretty common theme in the mission so far, probably so Rockstar could ensure that the player remains completely engaged during the shootouts. But this goes on to pose more of an issue than what I would have originally thought in my later attempts. I gave this idle, non-contact strategy a couple of tries just to be sure. I mixed it up a little by running around and taking cover in different positions too, and even tried blocking some of the enemy shots here and there, but as I suspected, doing basically nothing in the shootout only ever resulted in the boys taking turns at being shot in the face and dying. So with the obvious strategy out of the way, it was time to start experimenting with ways to keep the shootout going so the boys wouldn't die before I had the chance to do anything. I want to call these next couple of attempts the discovery phase. Nothing really notable happened, it was really just me running around, gathering as much information about the level as I could, you know, getting a feel for where all the enemies spawned, how many enemies there actually were, what their mother's maiden name was, and what the town they grew up in was called. I mean, Dutch did say he needed money after all, so... Anyway, after my first 10 or so attempts, I learned some very important information that would set the foundation for figuring out exactly how we could complete this with as few kills or knockouts as possible. First thing I discovered is that these enemies are very unlike the ones we encountered at the shack in episode 1. At the shack, we could kind of just afford to run around at a leisurely pace, you know? Tank the shots from the enemy's cute little revolvers and pretty much stand in the open watching the world go by without much consequence. But these guys are a whole other can of worms. Instead of being armed with those adorable little cap guns the other guys had, these guys had some very powerful rifles that dealt a lot of damage at a really long range. Couple that with the fact that there's a total of 16 enemies altogether at once this time, and there are almost no positions in the entire area that you won't be open to fire from, and you have a much more difficult time staying alive, which I found out a lot. Additionally, I discovered that disarming enemies was just enough to prevent the mission from ending right off the bat most times, and I also found out how important it was to conserve my food and health tonics, as getting to different points of cover while disarming enemies pretty much guaranteed a loss in health every time. I also started developing a couple of loose routes that I could take, nothing solid yet, but one in particular could allow me to sneak up to this shack and engage the enemies late, so I could pretty much begin the shootout from a completely different angle than before. My plan going forward was pretty simple. I just wanted to try disarming all 16 enemies to see if the boys could take out more of them quicker and without so much trouble. I was pretty certain that this wouldn't result in Dutch, Bill and Micah being able to kill every single enemy, but I had to at least attempt it just to be sure. A couple of attempts later, and I was already beginning to realize exactly how difficult it was to disarm all of these enemies by hand without ending up holier than a tennis racket wielded by none other than Jesus Christ himself. The rifles these enemies were armed with, they dealt way too much damage to stand out in the open while going through the disarming animation, and to make things worse, all of the enemies I had encountered so far needed to be disarmed twice, as getting rid of their rifle caused them to draw their sidearm instead. An extreme example of this being our good friend 3-Gun Gary, who, living up to his name, had 3 guns that needed to be disarmed rather than 2. Basically, the point of these early attempts was to find out exactly what I was working with here. I needed to know what worked and what didn't at the most basic level first, not just to be sure that these basic ideas didn't work, but also so I could flesh out some more potential strategies for when they inevitably failed. And I just want to say, I would love to go through and describe the entire process of exactly what happened during this mission, because there was a lot of strategies that I thought were going to result in a 0 knockout completion that eventually went dead. But after these initial couple of attempts, just me weeding out the stuff that definitely wasn't going to work, there were a lot of attempts that came after. And that sounds like a stupidly obvious statement for a video like this, but when I say a lot, I mean, there was a lot. Too many. Too many days spent trying to get a strategy that was clearly impossible to work. And when it comes down to it, there are just some enemies, I'm guessing, in all of these sorts of missions that aren't scripted to be taken out by anyone else but you. And don't get me wrong, I might have a blueberry-sized brain, but I definitely already understood that. My problem was spending days trying to find out exactly what the absolute lowest number of that was, and how I could achieve it while being 100% confident that it was in fact the lowest. I was pretty confident we could get away without any kills, but what was the lowest amount of knockouts we could achieve? Because if I was going to do this at all, I was going to try to do it right. So as much as I'd love to detail everything that happened on this absolutely soul-crushing journey, it's probably better that I just hit the important bits, because this video is definitely going to be long enough as it is. So join me as we delve into the real journey. The real 100-something attempt journey condensed into a couple of minutes. The discovery phase was over. It was time to jump straight into my initial plan of restraining every enemy with the lasso. Manually disarming left me too open, the enemies dealt too much damage, and even if I did manage to disarm an enemy before dying, having one running around trying to bust my skull open posed more of a problem than what they did with a gun. So I grabbed my lasso, made my way to 3-Gun Gary, and began rapidly tapping circle to restrain him. This is what's supposed to happen when you do this, and this is what happened instead. For some reason, restraining enemies with a lasso in this mission was a no-go. I tried every possible variation of tying the enemy up that I could, but they just couldn't be restrained. Despite the fact that my plan was now dead and slowly rotting in its grave, this caused me to discover a new strategy that I ended up running with for quite a while. The enemies dealing too much damage with their rifles was still a big problem, not just for me, but also for Dutch, Bill, and Micah too. Either they would die or I would after a certain amount of time, so lessening the damage of the enemies seemed essential at this point. I began using my lasso to trip the enemies, forcing them into dropping their rifles and resorting to their sidearms. The difference in damage was pretty apparent straight away. And not only that, but staying constantly engaged in the shootout by running around and attempting to disarm everybody this way greatly improved how long the boys could stay in the fight. However, this didn't seem to be a completely reliable solution, as after either a certain amount of time or after a certain amount of enemies killed, the mission just would end regardless. And I just want to say I tried this strategy a lot. I wanted to count what the absolute maximum amount of enemies that the boys could kill this way, so obviously I needed a lot of attempts to get an accurate number. But at the very least, the results I got were pretty consistent. With me just running around using the lasso to take the rifles away, the boys' kill count varied a couple of times, but it never went above 6. Now this strategy might not have been the solution, but getting to 6 wasn't possible before engaging in the shootout this way, so it was definitely a game changer at the very least. Unfortunately, because I'm an idiot, 6 kills just wasn't going to cut it for me. Even though the main goal of this playthrough was to kill as few people as possible, I wasn't about to go and knock out 8 people either, because I was still determined to only put someone in sleep mode when it was 100% necessary. So there was still a lot of testing to be done. And after trying every variation of the disarm and wait strategy that I could, and that is a huge emphasis on every variation. I became desperate for a solution. I needed to do something different at this point. It had been over 40 attempts at basically the same thing already, and if I died trying to Peter Parker the rifles out of every enemy's hands one more time, I might have just had a stroke in my chair. So for the next couple of hours worth of attempts, I went through a phase of completely bizarre and useless strategies that I can only really think was some sort of coping mechanism now that I look back on it. I ran all the way back up to the mountain to get Frank's help. Mission failed. I tried knocking Lenny and Javier off the mountain for no apparent reason. Didn't work. I restarted the mission and tried bringing Frank with me to the shootout. I restarted the mission and used Frank to murder Lenny. I restarted the mission and went for a ride down the mountain with Frank, and all that I found out in this countless amount of useless attempts is that these weren't even attempts anymore. This was me completely avoiding another attempt. And it's hard for me to convey in this video since I've had to cut out so much, but I had already tried so many different strategies and so many variations of those strategies that the thought of going back down to the beginning of that mission just about drove me insane.
What are we doing, Dutch? I can take this if you want. What are we doing, Dutch? I can take this if you want. What are we doing, Dutch? I can take this if you want. I can take this if you want. I can take this if you want. I can take this if you want.
So I went back down to the start of the mission, after a day of completely avoiding the game, of course, and just when I was considering accepting defeat and knocking out the remaining 8 enemies that the boys just couldn't kill, I discovered something that completely and utterly saved us. In fact, it saved this entire series because I was at the point where I just wouldn't accept knocking out 8 enemies at all. Our good boy Arthur just wouldn't do that unless we 100% had to. And since the beginning of this mission, for some reason, I was convinced that 8 knockouts was absolutely not the minimum. Now I know we all have our opinions of the man I'm about to mention. I know how unanimously hated he is for the way he acts and the things he's done. Trust me, I know. I know how despised he is even in this series already for having abandoned us last episode when we needed him the most, but I'm beginning to think that maybe all of Arthur's highly honourable actions have started to take effect on the ones around him. Because when I say that I discovered something that saved this playthrough, what I really mean is that I discovered someone who saved this playthrough. I was at a complete loss. I had tried more strategies than what I could possibly fit into this video. From attempting to get the enemies to shoot each other to bobsledding with Frank, I'd tried it all. And at this point, it was nothing short of idiotic for me to assume that anything would result in a better outcome than 8 knockouts by me and 6 kills from the boys. But then it happened. I decided to try disarming enemies individually again. I don't know why, but I had the random impulse to just give it one more shot. But this time, I brought them one by one to Dutch, Bill, and Micah so the enemy could be killed without anyone having to move up. I used my old route to get into the shack and disarm this enemy before he repositioned out into the open, then led him around the back to where Dutch, Bill, and Micah had taken cover. But instead of him being killed immediately like I had originally expected, he got Micah in a hold of some sort. Something I hadn't seen in any of my attempts so far. Bill spun around and turned the enemy's face into mashed potato, but Micah just stood there for a moment completely still, almost as though he was contemplating something. And then, in a split second, he pulled a knife from his pocket, and he stood there, staring into my soul, almost like he could see the desperation after all of my failed attempts. And I don't know what happened inside that man's brain, but Micah snapped. Before I could even stop to think, Micah made an unexpected break for the middle of the battlefield. I followed him close behind, completely confused, as he sprinted up the stairs and plunged his knife into one of the O'Driscolls. All of the enemies still had their ridiculously powerful rifles, as I hadn't disarmed everybody, and so I began trying to assist Micah as best I could by tripping them with the lasso as we went. I retreated into one of the cabins to replenish my health and came back out to see him standing over another one of his victims. This man had suddenly become unstoppable. Before I could even contemplate what was going on, he was off again, weaving through the shacks to take his next victim by surprise. I preemptively made a break for the O'Driscoll that I knew would be taking cover inside this shack and stripped him of his rifle before Micah came sprinting through the door to finish the job. I had no clue what the fuck was happening, but it was like Micah had been a sleeper agent all along and somebody just whispered the trigger word in his ear. I was confused to say the least, but I definitely wasn't complaining. The two of them fought inside the shack for a little, but this particular enemy was putting up a lot more of a fight than what any of the others had so far. Micah had been absolutely unstoppable up to this point, and I wasn't about to doubt his capabilities after he just took out 3 armed men with only a knife, but I hadn't had an attempt as successful as this in days. I wasn't about to take the risk of Micah dying, so I threw my lasso at the stubborn enemy and dragged him out of the shack. Micah was so eager to get his hands on this dude that he did some sick parkour over the railing and got right back to trying to end his life. I realized I'd been so amazed this entire time that I hadn't even checked the map to see how many enemies had been killed yet. Before Micah unexpectedly snapped, the maximum I ever saw, again, was 6. But now, there was 10 enemies out of 16 gone. After seeing how many hits this enemy had taken from Micah already, it was obvious to me now that this was just one of them that wasn't scripted to be handled by anyone else but me. So I went in for the unavoidable knockout while Micah stood back and cheered me on. This was teamwork like I'd never seen. After an intense fight that I almost died in, the enemy had finally been knocked down, so Micah and I just got straight back to work. So far, 1 knockout by me, and 10 kills from Dutch, Bill, and Micah. Just 5 enemies remained. Dutch and Bill had moved up now. Micah ran in even more vicious than before. He took out 1 enemy, and then another. With just 3 enemies now remaining, I got rid of the water tower guy's rifle and spun around to assist Micah. But then, after what seemed like the perfect attempt, Micah the Unstoppable was somehow stopped. I didn't know why after he'd just decimated half the enemies with only a knife, but there it was again, the mission failed screen. And I wasn't so discouraged as I was worried that Micah's ability to transform into John Wick and Mike Ehrmantraut's love child might not be able to be replicated. And so, in a panic, I got onto the next attempt right away. I sprinted to the shack, disarmed the enemy, led him to Micah, still nervous that the previous attempt could not be replicated. I stood beside Micah so the enemy would attack him first, but Bill decided to ruin our plan by getting trigger happy once again. So I set off to find another enemy to disarm, and I thought back on just how much trouble 3-Gun Gary had given me in so many of my previous attempts, so I thought it'd only be right to use him to trigger Micah. I got rid of all 3 of his guns, led him to where the boys were taking cover, and prayed to cowboy Christ that this would work. Micah wasn't in his usual spot, which was pretty normal. It happened every couple of attempts, but when I went inside, the enemy didn't follow. Because Bill shot our Micah triggerer once again. And yes, that's what I'm calling it now, the Micah triggerer. We'll work on the name later. Anyway, I went on the hunt for the 3rd Micah triggerer, decided to get this guy, brought him to Micah, and this time, Bill didn't get the chance to ruin our plan. The enemy ran at Micah and quite possibly made the greatest mistake of his life. He bitch slapped Micah. And we all know by now that Micah must have some sort of PTSD from bitch slaps after episode 1. And because of that bitch slap, I'm telling you, it was because of that bitch slap, Micah's transformation was replicated. Unfortunately, I accidentally picked the enemy that wasn't scripted to be taken out by anyone other than me, but because I knew I'd be forced into taking him out at some point anyway, I stepped in and gave him the necessary concussion. The important thing right now is that Micah was back in the game, ready to help us once again. And after that bitch slap, Micah most definitely did not hold back. And although at the time it was annoying that Bill had killed a couple of our Micah triggerers, the trigger-happy attitude actually made sure that there were even less enemies now for us to take on. Things hadn't gone this right in over 100 attempts, so you can understand my nervousness. 3 enemies showed on the map, but 4 were remaining, counting the man on the water tower. I continued restraining them as Micah hunted them down, one brutal assassination after the other. The enemies were being wiped off the face of the planet by one man with a knife, and eventually, only one remained, the man on the water tower. I was like an overprotective parent. I didn't want Micah climbing all the way up there because I was sure that if he fell, he would die. But I also did not want to risk pulling the enemy down and accidentally killing him. So I disarmed his rifle while trying to figure out exactly what the best move was, but Micah didn't hesitate. He began climbing the ladder and there was absolutely no way that I could stop him. He reached the top, and I'd never been closer to a heart attack in my life when he threw the enemy from the top and came falling down with him. I expected at least one of them to die. I even prepared myself to see the mission failed screen, but both of them rose to their feet immediately and began fighting. I ended up tying the enemy after realizing he had a knife too, as I couldn't risk Micah dying here at all. But after Micah not only launched him off the water tower, but also attacked him over and over on the ground with no result, I realized that this enemy was also one that was not scripted to be handled by anyone but Arthur, which meant that after over 100 attempts at just this one mission, I could finally say for sure that knocking 8 enemies out was definitely not the minimum. And thanks to none other than Micah Bell and his bitch slap PTSD, we were able to get this far with the perfect ratio of 2 knockouts by me and 14 kills from the boys. Meaning that our current total for Arthur stands at 0 kills and only 5 knockouts. But this, unfortunately, was a success that we could only enjoy for a very short moment.